All right. Hello, everybody. Good evening. It is a pleasure to be with you again this evening, and I thank you for joining the talk today. So I will talk about driving and epilepsy today. There are lots of I think issues about driving and from social and daily life standpoint, as well as from the legal aspects of that we hope we can review in the next half an hour or so. First of all, driving, as we know, is a part of essential daily life of most of us who have been driving, and then we come with some eventually issues or questions or restrictions in epilepsy. There has been lots of studies, lots of surveys, questionnaires sent to patients with epilepsy, and it always is ranked. Driving is always ranked as number one concern for patients, among other factors of daily and social life, including work or being able to remain independent and so on. And driving is always number one time and time again in various surveys or quality of life, KOL, quality of life surveys. And that has been consistently in the findings and studies and research in the past, probably 40, 50 years consistently has been the top concern of patients, even more than employment, for example, associated with epilepsy and so on. So I want to just first set a background here, and and I want to compare the risks of driving in epilepsy compared to some other medical conditions. So if we look at some data, for example, this is a publication from a while ago, about maybe 20 years ago, but still kind of more recent data suggests is more or less still this data applicable. So it looked at the medical causes of fatal crashes and motor vehicle accidents that resulted in death. So when they looked at the relative risk of the fatal crash rate, again, motor vehicle accidents that result in mortalities, in the general population is something around 22.4 per 100,000 of the population. And it's 2.6 times greater than those with seizures. Again, so because there are also other conditions that that contribute to that number. So, but this kind of the share of the seizures in that fatal crashes is 8.6 per 100,000. For example, alcohol use, we know, also is an important and devastating cause of fatal crashes, and that's even more than those with seizures. It's 8 times greater than those with seizures. But at the same time, if we compare the relative risk of fatal crashes in patients who have seizure compared to diseases that also can impair driving, for example, cardiovascular disease or heart attack, if someone has that while they're driving, having a seizure significantly increases the risk compared to cardiovascular disease, 2.3 times higher that risk is. or conditions like diabetes also, which lots of times can lead to impairments of consciousness, whether the blood sugar drops suddenly because of the medication, and that can lead, this is one of the risks of diabetes. Some patients with diabetes, because of the maybe at some point too much medication for diabetes, the blood sugar kind of drops, that can lead to loss of consciousness. So that's one, comparing to those with diabetes, is the risk with seizures in terms of fatal crashes is 4.6 times greater. There are studies, they looked at what is characteristics of motor vehicle crashes or MCV, motor vehicle accidents, in those who have epilepsy and drive. So there was again another, there are lots of studies. I kind of sampled a few to just show you some data here. This is another one study that was published in a few years ago in 2018. So they looked at 71 crashes that was as a result of a seizure or a seizure related, not necessarily seizure itself, because there are other factors in those who have epilepsy and driving that may be dealing with, such as side effects of medications, for probably drowsiness that comes as a result of the side effect of medication. So seizure related, we kind of lump them together. 71 seizure related crashes, 37 of them resulted in injury. So the time of the first seizure to the motor vehicle crash or the accident, that interval on average was 10 years. So it's not that it was not the case that in most instances someone had recently been diagnosed with epilepsy and then a crash or accident happened. So there was a long interval on average. Again, this is an average value. And about 8%, so not a large number, but about 8% of these crashes were for the first time seizures rather than chronic seizure. And 20% of crashes actually happened also, which is again a large number. About 1/5 of the crashes happened before even the diagnosis of epilepsy was made. And among those who already had a diagnosis of epilepsy, about 20%, again, something around 1/5 of them were not on any medications. So there are, so I think that again tells us the risk of accidents can be at any point during that diagnosis timeline of the epilepsy. Can happen before the epilepsy is diagnosed, can happen for the at the setting of the first time seizure, can happen at someone who had a chronic epilepsy, but the significant number of the accidents and crashes happened in those who have not been on medications. However, again, it was a good thing, at least if you're looking again at the half of the glass being full, is that at least from the legal standpoint, a majority of them already had cleared kind of the legal aspects of the criteria to drive, but that means also the 30%, or about 1/3, were not legally, from legal standpoint, we're supposed to drive. Now, what are the risk factors for, I'm going to just mention a few things. What are the risk factors for motor vehicle crashes or accidents in epilepsy? In other words, what makes someone more likely to have an accident while driving? And so this is a graph. I just want to explain it a bit. So this is odds ratio, meaning this odds ratio is usually a value between 0 and 1. And the higher the value is, the higher the risk is. I mean, after certain statistical analysis and looking at the risk of each of these factors, it can be determined which factor plays a heavier role or heavier risk of being associated with seizure. So again, the higher number, the higher the number is, the higher the risk is. So as we see here, and I want to focus on these first 4 items because these are the most important ones. I mean, I don't get into details of the 3, so just focus on these first four. So as you see here, in terms of seizure freedom or length of or duration of seizure freedom, the longer, comparing actually at three scales of 3 months, minimum of 3 months seizure freedom, minimum of 6 months, and minimum of 12 months or 1 year seizure freedom. And as you see here, if someone has been only 3 months seizure free or a minimum of 3 months, the risk is 0.428, which is not very low. So it is basically in this, comparing these 3 has the higher risk. But if we extend that to 6 months of seizure freedom minimum, that risk significantly decreases, as you see here. And then if we extend that even to 12 months, the risk becomes even lower. So keep that in mind. This is very important as we're going to continue to talk about this. The other factor is reliable auras, right? And we know that in epilepsy and seizures, some patients or some types of seizures are associated with auras. Some patients experience the auras, and they might be very different types of auras. Sometimes it's just an unexplainable or difficult to explain feeling that the seizure is coming. Sometimes it's hard to put that in words, as lots of patients testify to that. And some patients may have more clear auras. They may have like visual auras, colors or dots of lights or such, or some other auras. Again, some abdominal auras, feeling kind of butterfly, feeling in the stomach. So if someone has reliable auras, meaning reliable here means that it's kind of consistent in most of their seizures, at least if not all, and it's usually kind of the same pattern, and they are able to recognize that very well when it comes on. This is kind of what it's called as reliable aura. So as you say, again, reliable auras, if someone has that, decreases the risk, because as soon as they feel that aura is coming, if they're driving, it gives them enough time to pull over before the seizure becomes kind of progress or becomes more severe to a point of loss of consciousness. So these are factors. Again, some of them makes kind of sense, and the statistics support that. Okay, so yeah, these are the ones that I wanted to mention. Now, as we saw in that previous slide, so when the seizure-free interval increases to more or equal than 12 months, the risk is reduced by 93% compared to those who have shorter intervals. Whereas if, again, minimum of 6 months is 85%, so the difference between two is meaningful, but it's not a high percentage, so it's still 6 months is good, 85% compared to patients with shorter intervals, but also again, 3 months, this risk is reduced, but is not something that is really, in terms of statistics, significant. So 3 months it's, in other words, kind of conclusion of this slide is 3 months of seizure freedom is not enough interval to significantly decrease the risk of accidents. And also seizure frequency was not in the statistics as a reliable indicator of odds or risks of crashing. In other words, if someone has, 2 seizures a week compared to someone who has 1 seizure every 3 months, statistically, that's not significantly different in terms of risk of crashing. So this reliable aura, again, we just talked about it. Just wanted to emphasize that. So as we said, reliable auras decreases the risk. Despite that, those patients, so something about like a quarter of patients who had also in some studies who had auras also got involved in accidents. The reasons were that either auras were too short, so they didn't get the chance to secure their vehicle and themselves in a safe standing state, or they were not able to pull over because of road conditions, heavy traffic, or some other conditions. So they were not able to pull over, or they felt the aura, but they felt, okay, I'm getting close to home. Let me get to home, faster, and that's not seems like a reliable or safe thing to do. So I think the conclusion from this slide is that I always kind of discuss that with patients who have epilepsy. If you're driving, try to drive not in the midline or middle lane or left lane. So try to be on the curbside lane as much as you can. So if you feel an aura, something unusual, it would be able to quickly pull over. And as soon as you feel an aura, even if you're not sure if it's an aura or not, because sometimes there might be some other symptoms that raises suspicion. Is this aura? Is this not aura? But even if in doubt, take it as an aura and basically pull over until you make sure that you're stable or somebody is called to come to your help or so on. So driving home, even if you're a short distance from home, doesn't seem like to be a safe way to do this. And patients that had frequent auras also in some scenarios, but not necessarily all their seizures are preceded by aura. They also may be at risk. Again, the consistency of the aura is important in determining the risk. So we're talking about the consistency. So sometimes having auras did not reduce the odds of crash. And if someone has auras once in a while, it's not a factor to rely on. All right, so now we talked a bit about the kind of the medical aspect of things, a bit of research data, a bit of social issues. Now let's look at the law and what are the laws and regulations. So what I'm going to put up here next is going to be the map of the United States, with every state kind of color-coded in terms of the length of seizure-free period that is required by law before they are granted driving privileges. And as you see, there is variable criteria or laws from state to state. Now, first, look at some that are kind of, they have coded with black color. And these are states that do not have actually a fixed period of time of seizure freedom in their law in terms of seizure restrictions. So it comes basically to the medical personnel and caregivers to determine kind of that, as long as it kind of complies with medical facts. And then we come to the kind of the darker gray, so 1 degree, kind of lighter gray are the states that have 12 months. And that includes South Dakota, Arkansas, Mississippi, and West Virginia, New Jersey. And if you are a resident of our beloved New York State, our New York State also falls into that 12 months seizure freedom per law. Okay, and I will talk about that a bit more, about how we usually determine that. But again, keep that in mind. By law, New York State is 12 months seizure freedom. And then we come again, other majority, as you see, majority of other states are a bit kind of lighter gray, are 6 months, and that includes again lots of kind of Midwest states and kind of Southeast states and Pennsylvania and Michigan. So, and then we have 3 months a state, which are mostly kind of the West Coast states, and Minnesota and Wisconsin, and Wyoming and Nebraska. So these are states that have 3 months restriction. Now if we move, let me actually move to the next slide before. Okay, so actually before talking about that, let me go back to this slide again. So one thing actually I wanted to mention here, again, we usually kind of always discuss this with patients. As we saw in one of the previous slides, 3 months seems like, based on the data or medical data and research, 3 months is not a safe period of time to wait. So the most common is 6 and 12. And as you saw, there is a difference between also 6 months seizure freedom and 12 months seizure freedom. That difference is, however, not statistically a large gap. So if you remember, 12 months seizure freedom decreased the risk by 93%, whereas 6 months by 85%. So the gap is there, but it's not too large of a gap. On the other hand, imposing 12 months, it has been argued in the legal standpoint and medical standpoint, has been argued when you impose a bit longer restriction, such as 12 months compared to 6 months, then rate of non-compliance increases. Patients, lots of people, may be able to arrange things for 6 months. They can live with it. When you get to 12 months, you may find some fraction of this patients and people, they may kind of escape that restriction and then start driving, at least sporadically, if not consistently, and that makes things even kind of more unsafe. So it has been argued between 12 months and 6 months. There are lots of arguments and discussion. So this is ongoing. We can talk about that for hours and hours. But the bottom line is, and I want to again focus on New York State. In New York State, by law, is 12 months. The final determination is by DMV medical board. So when someone is applying for driver's license or reinstatement of their driver's license or renewal of the, then the DMV medical board usually requires or asks for a statement or a release, basically from your provider, from your medical caregivers. They take that into account, but the final determination is by DMV. In the medical community, considering it differs kind of case by case, in every patient might be different. So in most of us neurologists consider 6 months to 12 months of seizure freedom before releasing someone for driving. And there are lots of other factors come into play. For example, how hard, how difficult has been to control the seizures of a patient. I'll give you an example. Someone, let's say, had 5 years of uncontrolled seizures. It has been a very difficult path. Lots of medications were tried, lots of side effects, lots of different options were considered, lifestyle changes, and so on. And after 5 years of difficult management, eventually the seizures become under control. For this patient, probably is not a good idea to release them after 6 months of seizure freedom. Probably those are cases that we go with 12 months. But if, let's say, someone had 5 years, during that 5 years, maybe they had a total of 6, 7 seizures, and then they're currently only on 2 medications, for example. And they are now controlled for 6 months. So that makes probably from medical standpoint to be more comfortable to release them for driving after 6 months rather than 12 months. And that's what we recommend in our forms when we write it to DMV based on the medical facts of the history of the patient. And we discuss that with the patients. And then we determine whether 6 months or 12 months is more appropriate. And then we send it to DMV. DMV, based on the same data that we have and recommend, eventually they make the final determination. Sometimes when we release a patient for 6 months, they also feel kind of, again, despite that the law is 12 months, the DMV also puts everything in perspective and grants basically privileges or reinstate the privileges after 6 months. But sometimes we may recommend that and they still don't feel it's safe and they deny that, and they will require someone to wait for 12 months. So there are lots of, again, factors plays a role. So now a couple of other things I want to kind of mention also before we conclude this talk. I thought it's interesting to just have some kind of historical facts to be looked at. I think it's interesting. So the first accident reported to be related to seizure was in 1906. And then soon after that, epilepsy was put on the category of conditions that it was prohibited from driving. And they patients with epilepsy were even not considered with even granting licenses at any point in their life, as long as they had epilepsy. But in 1940s or late 1940s, then some data came around that, okay, if someone is attained good control with medications, they might be relatively safe to resume driving. And eventually, again, internationally, that was in England for the first time that this advocacy started with for individuals with epilepsy to be able to drive under certain circumstances when their seizures are under good control. And eventually, Wisconsin was the first state in 1949 that allowed individuals with good control of seizures to drive. By 1965, so that within about like 15 years or so, 18 states developed similar laws. And then the trend continues in 1970s and 1980s. So again, it's kind of a long story. I think it was interesting to look at some historical facts here also. Now, I think the last couple of slides, I just want to mention or talk about what is the requirements for reporting. So I start by saying that in all states, the responsibility by law to report having conditions such as seizure and epilepsy to DMV. All right, there's no difference of that between any states. All the states by law require that basic responsibility falls on patients to report that condition to DMV. In addition, however, there are a few states that require the medical staff also to report that to DMV. And those states that require that, or basic physicians or medical, again, system, And those are California, Delaware, New Jersey, Oregon, and Pennsylvania and Nevada. Okay, so New York State is not, but as you see, two of our neighbor states are Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So in New York State, we are not required. Again, we discuss that with the patients. We tell them that's by law, that is their responsibility to report that to the DMV. And we strongly we encourage that, and we have faith and confidence in our patients that they follow the medical advice and the law. There have been, or unfortunately, there are situations that some for various reasons, but occasionally there are patients that may not want to follow the medical advice and medical and laws, and that's obviously puts not only themselves in danger, but puts others also in danger. And that's situations that are the only situations that by law that the physicians are expected to report that to DMV if we know someone is not safe to drive because they may lead to damage or harm to others, and to continue to drive despite poor control of their seizures. Those are situations that leaves us with no choice other than discussing that with the patient and let them know that we have to kind of report that to DMV. Unfortunately, again, it's not very common at all. So now, as I said, so I talked about this, all individuals are required by law, all states to report their condition. Just want to also mention a survey that was published in research about this survey of 213 patients that was done in Ohio. So about 20%, 19% reported that they're not honest even with their doctors about the frequency of seizures in order to be able to drive, which again, puts things in not making things safe. However, also even close to even half of the patients did not know their state regulations. I think being aware of the regulations, being aware of the law, being aware of the rationale behind the law and medical advice makes things more digestible by everybody, making sure everybody's on the same page to understand again that nobody wants to make their life difficult. We know that restriction of driving is difficult, but safety of patients and safety of the others is the priority in every aspect of our lives. And I think that's pretty much all I had for today. Thank you so much for your attention, and I would be happy to take the rest of the time for questions and comments.